Professor Jean Bethke Elshtain is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Social and Political Ethics at the University of Chicago. She is also the author of more than 500 essays in scholarly journals and journals of civic opinion. She is the New Republic. Of her several hundred guest lectures at universities in the United States and abroad, over 36 have been endowed lectureships. She's written numerous books that would be of interest and relevant for her lecture here today. I'll just mention a few of them. But her most recent book, Just War Against Terror, was nominated as one of the best nonfiction books of 2003 by Publishers Weekly. Faith Matters, Religion and Public Life in America, co-author with Aziza Al-Hibri and Charles Haynes. Jane Addams and the Dream of American Democracy, which was published in 2002 and was runner-up as Best Biography of the Year by the Society of Midland Authors. The Jane Addams Reader, Who Are We? Critical Reflections and Hopeful Possibilities, Politics and Ethical Discourse, named Best Book by the American Society of Theological Booksellers, and the list goes on and on. Professor Elshtain has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, a scholar in residence, Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Conference and Study Center, Como, Italy, and a Guggenheim Fellow. She is the recipient of the Ellen Gregg Inwalls Award for Excellence in Classroom Teaching, the highest award for undergraduate teaching at Vanderbilt University. She served as a member of the Board of Trustees at the Institute for Advanced Study, and is on the Board of Trustees of the National Humanities Center in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, the Kennan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, and the Board of Directors of the National Endowment for Democracy. In 2003 through 2004, she holds the McGuire Chair in Ethics at the Library of Congress. Professor Elshtain also currently serves as co-chair of the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life and chair of the Council on Families in America. She was chair of the Council on Civic Society and a member of the National Commission for Civic Renewal and the Penn Commission on American Culture and Society from 1996 to 1999. She was a Phi Beta Kappa Scholar from 1997 to 1998. And she served as the Vice President of the American Political Science Association for the 1998-1999 academic year. In addition to these and many other honors, her 1995 book, Democracy on Trial, firmly established Professor Elshtain's reputation as a public intellectual. The New York Times Book Review called her treatise on the decline of civil society, quote, wise, humane, and profoundly reflective, while the Utne Reader named her as an author to its list of 100 visionaries for the next century. In fact, in 1996, she delivered a BYU Forum speech titled Democracy at Century's End. The Kennedy Center has invited Professor Elshtain here today to address another issue of great importance, not only to this country, but one that's been discussed at length by the international community, and that is specifically America's use of force as a response to terrorism. I would commend you to Publisher Weekly's comments about this book. Quote, since the attacks of September 11th, academics and policy experts have scrambled to reassess the international role of the U.S. in the face of rising Islamic fundamentalism. Most agree that there can be no reconciliation with extremists who want to destroy the U.S. and that it is our responsibility to use force to fight terrorism wherever it may be. Elshtain, to this conventional wisdom, Elshtain provides a moral framework for America's war against terrorism, convincingly arguing that the U.S. military action is not only necessary for self-preservation, but it is ethical. I'd like to note that last week, 4 distinguished faculty members from political science, English, ancient scripture, and psychology met together to talk about some of the ideas and the arguments in this book in preparation and anticipation for this visit. And I'd commend that discussion to you as well, which is available on the Kennedy Center's website. Please join with me today in welcoming to BYU Professor Jean Bethke Elshtain.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I was happy to be reminded that I was here in 1996. I hadn't forgotten that I'd been here, but the years all, you reach a certain age, the years all collapse into the past. And I hadn't remembered the year, but I'm pleased to have that recalled in my behalf. My day started at 4 a.m. on the East Coast. I gave a talk yesterday in Savannah, Georgia. I think that's 2 a.m. your time. I trust that I will be coherent, but if I start babbling, Corey, just gently lead me off the stage. I trust that won't happen. I should alert you to the fact that Just War Against Terror will be coming out in a paperback version, I believe in August, with an appendix taking account of the Iraq War. That's an issue, obviously, that is much on our minds today, especially insofar as it has been framed within the just war tradition. That also gave me an opportunity to deal with the typos and the errata that had crept into the book, including some confusion about the dates of two great popes, which every medievalist in the country, I'm sure, noticed, if any medievalist looked at the book. So I was happy to correct all of that. As I reflected on my topic for today, there were two different ways I thought I might go. One was a rather more philosophic discussion of the principle that I call a principle of equal regard, and the claim that people have to make in their own behalf for the use of coercive force, that is, coercive force to assist them when they are victims of some of the horrors that the 20th century and, alas, the 21st century seem to be dishing out in some abundance, the most critical, of course, being forms of ethnic cleansing. And in that rather more philosophic argument, I talked about America's particular power in that regard. The other strategy I hit upon, and it's the one I decided upon finally, was to talk a bit about the Iraq conflict and just war, to say some general things about the just war tradition, because I can't assume that all of you have either studied it or read the book, and then to go back and remind us of what happened on 9/11, September 11th, 2001. I think it is fading already in our memories, and we do need to be reminded, I think, from time to time about the reasons for why the United States remains in the arena and why we continue to fight this war against terror or war against terrorism, and there is, as you know, no end in sight, not for the foreseeable future. It's fascinating to me that the just war tradition is so much on the agenda today as one framework within which matters of war and peace are discussed. It wasn't always so. There was a period of time when this tradition was largely eclipsed in our thinking about war and peace, certainly within the arena of public policy and among international relations scholars. The era of the Cold War seemed an era within which just war seemed largely irrelevant to many. The Catholic bishops in 1983, with their letter on peace, the challenge of peace, tried to put, and I think succeeded to a certain extent, putting the issue of just war back into the picture. But it's really been the post-1989 developments, the end of the Cold War, the Persian Gulf War of 1991, the eruption of horrors like ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia, the slaughter of Rwandan Tutsis by Rwandan Hutus, the continuing depredations of the Saddam Hussein regime until recently, that have really inspired people to think about the issue of war in ethical terms and to think about U.S. reaction in that way, so that our policymakers now at least use some of the categories and some of the terms of just war when they're thinking about these issues. How much it is penetrated into the world of academic international relations, I think, is rather another question. I know some of you here talk about it. It is my general impression that the world of international relations theory, at least, is still so dominated by an approach called neo-realism that the just war tradition has yet to make a dent in many places. But that said, I'm happy to be discussing it here, and I want to begin my formal remarks by reminding us that in his State of the Union message of January last year, President Bush urged the legitimacy of the use of armed force as a last resort, which of course is a category from the just war tradition, as a last resort to disarm the Saddam Hussein regime. And he further claimed that, should it come to war, the United States would fight in a just cause and by just means. Now, I think I've already said enough to suggest that this was not just intelligent political rhetoric on the president's part, that his use of the language of justice in assessing a resort to force and at the same time in limiting the means to be deployed should force become necessary, linked the Iraq crisis prior to the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom to this venerable tradition of ethical restraint and justification known as just war. Assessment of just causes, in Latin use ad bellum, and just means, in Latin use in bello, originate in attempts by such great fathers of the Christian Church as St. Augustine, the 5th century, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century, and later reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, to come to grips with the responsibilities of governments in a fallen world. Now, imbued with the so-called double love command, that is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, and this latter love captured by the term caritas, Christian theology stretched the boundary of ethical concern beyond family and tribe and territory. All persons are children of God, therefore all deserve equal moral regard. Now, in many ways, this is a counterintuitive notion. Our thickest moral obligations are to our own, to family, to friends, to those civic brothers and sisters we call citizens, fellow citizens, to members of our church communities. But within the framework of the theological doctrine that I'm talking about, the insistence was that no one, that is, no stranger, should be altogether outside the boundary of ethical concern and responsibility. Now, this universal doctrine led over time to specific injunctions about the use of force, all aimed at limiting both the occasions for war as well as the means of fighting, without ruling coercive force altogether illegitimate, without ruling it out. Now, it's important here to note that the primary Christian teaching over the centuries on war and war-making has consisted of variants on this just war tradition. Strict pacifism has always been a distinctive and distinctly minority posture. Indeed, one can even find powerful criticisms of absolute pacifism from great teachers in the Christian church, something that surprises many who are unfamiliar with the Christian tradition. For to do nothing when people are being assaulted, hounded, slaughtered, expelled, may well be a greater infraction by far than the resort to force, appropriately guided and limited by just war teaching, to try to stop such infractions. This jumps ahead of the story a bit, so let's, for a moment, consider the occasions for war, this jus ad bellum. Now, all the thinkers I noted before wrote their great books before the emergence of the modern state system, with its notion of state sovereignty. Once that idea gets enshrined, boundaries of states, states being defined as particular territories that are bounded in a certain way, the boundaries of states began to be understood as nigh sacrosanct, and this led over time to the notion that boundary crossing, or the crime of aggression, was the single knockdown casus belli, or just cause, occasion for war. Now, this legalistic definition narrowed the notion of just cause, and if adhered to, it would make it almost impossible for one nation to commit itself to the use of force against another unless it had been the subject of a direct attack. But just cause doesn't begin and end with a direct attack on one's own soil. There are other factors, other criteria to weigh in assessing whether a resort to force is or is not justified. Now, in order to understand that, we have to think about the political ethic that really is embedded in the just war tradition. That ethic is an ethic of responsibility. And the just war tradition offers a way to exercise that responsibility. This way of thinking then rejects both the ethic of Machiavellian realpolitik, anything goes if it serves state interest or raison d'etat, but it rejects as well an ethic that forswears action if that action commits the country to the use of armed force in a responsible and limited way. Now, many of the injunctions of the just war tradition over the centuries have been encoded in international agreements and conventions that stipulate what is or is not acceptable in fighting between nations, the so-called law or laws of war. They don't reference the just war tradition specifically, but many of these stipulations derive in the first instance from that tradition. Now, to determine whether or not force is being used in a just cause, the just war tradition insists that a war must be openly and legally fought. A war must be a response to a specific instance of unjust aggression or to the very high probability of such aggression. A war must be a last resort, meaning that other avenues have been considered. You don't have to have tried every single one of them, but you have to have considered other alternatives seriously. You must pursue the war with the right intention, meaning that aggrandizement for your own nation is out. A just war could never be a war simply to extend your own territory, for example. And there should be a strong probability of success. The idea there being you don't take the solemn step of war if the likelihood is that more harm than good will come of it. Now, there is another consideration in this jus ad bellum framework that taps directly into St. Augustine's 5th century masterwork on the city of God. Augustine argues that the obligation of charity means that a war may be occasioned by a requirement to protect those in no position to defend themselves, those called the innocent in this tradition, to protect them from certain harm. When you hear references or read references to the innocent in the just war tradition, it doesn't mean morally innocent, as none of us is that, but it means innocent in the sense of incapable of self-defense. So this obligation of caritas extends beyond the boundaries of one's own polity to encompass those in other countries who may require protection, assistance, and even active intervention if they are being brutalized, murdered, terrorized by overwhelming or despotic force. Now, these considerations figure centrally in debates about prevention of genocide, for example, or in cases of so-called humanitarian rescue. And they lay at the heart of our debate over whether a war against the Saddam Hussein regime was or was not justified. The requirement of caritas tells us that if, in addition to a serious threat against one's own people, one adds a history of ongoing brutalization of citizens of other polities, it enforces the legitimacy of an occasion for war. It's not a knockdown argument, but it does mean that these are serious and legitimate considerations that need to be taken account when one is making a decision about whether or not to commit one's nation to the use of force. Now, in the sections of his massive Summa, in which St. Thomas Aquinas discusses justification for and limits to the use of force, Aquinas calls this activity of interdiction, of stopping harm and punishing the wrongdoers. He calls it the repression of wrongdoing. and he applies it both to the offensive as well as the defensive use of force. Now, what this means is that a passive toleration of massive injustice and wrongdoing in the name of peace may well be, according to St. Thomas, a very serious offense. Now, here I think that many of our clergy and our churches, in their collective statements on the Iraq situation in the run-up to the war, got some things wrong. That is, they forgot warnings about an unjust or a false peace. That is, within the just war tradition, you cannot automatically assume that peace is better than war. And Augustine was withering in his criticism of circumstances called peace that were actually a cover beneath which massive harm was being done. And he wrote in his masterwork, The City of God, peace and war had a competition in cruelty, and peace won the prize. He says, look at all the things done in the name of peace. And Augustine calls this a false peace. A false peace is one that permits massive injustice and imminent threats to go unanswered on the assumption that any peace is better than any war. Now, St. Augustine's mordant observations came home to me before the war began, as I read the banners being carried by protesters, especially in Europe, in what Secretary Rumsfeld calls Old Europe, but in some of our homegrown marches too. I was in London in December before the heated debate on the Iraq War in the States and before the war commenced in March a year ago. And I wondered what sort of peace the protesters thought the Iraqi people had at that point in time. Was it the peace of a situation in which an unusually brutal regime, even by the world's low standards, continued to conduct business as usual? Was the maintenance of such a regime in power really morally preferable to an alternative that disturbed that peace, the peace of torture and amputations and starvation and rape as a political weapon and threats to families and use of deadly chemicals in direct violation of the 1922 Convention prohibiting use of poison gases as a weapon of war, a ruling that was extended in 1925 to bacteriological agents? Was the continuing threat and reality of that really peace? Now, Iraqis in exile, 1/5 of the nation being in exile at that time, told their stories about what life was like under Saddam Hussein, but as Tony Blair pointed out, these stories were largely ignored, or people were prepared to ignore them. And those who described the pre-war situation as one of peace then didn't confront seriously those realities and tell us what they proposed to do about them. If you don't want a war and you accept that this is the situation, then what are some alternatives as a way to deal with such a regime, especially in an era defined by universal human rights, which are here being violated in the most brutal kinds of ways? So the just war tradition is also about a just peace, not a false peace. And that is a tradition that I fear many seem to have abandoned, certainly in Europe, in favor of a vague combination of anti-Americanism, which seems to be the new form of nationalism, appropriately masked, and a notion of internationalism that consists entirely of so-called soft power, where the assumption is that one need never commit to the use of coercive force. Those who make that argument seem to forget that sometimes hard power makes effective soft power possible. Now, the discussion emanating from those who sought to obstruct the United States and Great Britain and the Security Council focused almost entirely on often quite legalistic concerns about Iraq's compliance or non-compliance with Resolution 1441, rather vague issues about whether any action outside the orbit of the UN is ever legitimate. If that indeed were the case, it would mean that most of the wars that the United States has been involved in would perforce be illegitimate. The issue of just cause in the just war sense didn't come into these discussions at all, so far as I could tell. And use in bello considerations or worry about them, that is the means, were similarly downplayed, save for expressed worries about a massive humanitarian catastrophe should war commence. And of course that massive humanitarian catastrophe never happened. The view was that the countries around Iraq would be overwhelmed with millions of refugees fleeing the scene of battle. The assumption was that the force the United States would bring to bear would be so massive that you would have complete destruction of the infrastructure of Iraqi society. It seemed pretty clear that that wouldn't be the case. Nevertheless, that was the assumption that was put forward. So let's summarize for just a moment. Just cause, competent authority, right intention, last resort, probability of success. If all these come together, it adds up to a justifiable occasion for war, justifiable casus belli. This doesn't mean you must respond with force. What it means is that a justice claim has been triggered and that a resort to force is justifiable without being automatic. So, looking at Iraq, a murderous regime without question, weapons of mass destruction most likely. Certainly there was strong reasons to believe that those were in existence, given the inventory at the end of Gulf War in 1991. Non-cooperation with 16, 17 UN resolutions, yes. So the question was, what do you do? What would you do? And the most telling argument made against military intervention was the insistence that such intervention would constitute a case of preemptive or preventive war, that the bar against such a war is set very high in the just war tradition, and that Iraq did not meet the test because there was no incontrovertible evidence about the threat directly to us of Iraq's possession of weapons of mass destruction and its probable use against us. So the focus was entirely on the threat to us and whether or not it was really imminent. There was not much focus on the possible connection between the Iraq regime and al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations of international scope and what might be going on there. So here we come to a conundrum within the just war tradition itself. Is your just war thinking shaped more by the theological tradition out of which just war emerges, as it has been absorbed into secular thinking and international agreements, or is it shaped more by a rather strict, juridical, state-centered Westphalian outlook? If you rank sovereignty the highest political good, preemption, prevention is pretty much ruled out unless you are directly attacked. If you rank justice a good that at times may trump sovereignty, preemption or prevention becomes more workable. Not easy, but easier to justify. Now, I took the latter position, but I also came to the conclusion that Iraq wasn't a very good test case for preemption, because what in fact we were doing was really a continuation of Persian Gulf War I that concluded with a truce, and Iraq was in fact in material breach of that truce, and that constituted a casus belli, or occasion for war. Now, if force is resorted to in a just cause, that's, as you know, not the end of the story. Just means limit the force to be used. This is the use in bello portion of the tradition. And the two central rules here are proportionality, and there are a couple of senses of this. One is that the punishment you inflict should be proportionate to the assault or crime that you have sustained, and also never to use more force than what is minimally necessary, proportionality, and most important of all, discrimination. You are never permitted to target civilians intentionally. That is, one must always discriminate between legitimate military targets, and by contrast, sites that are exclusively legitimate military targets, and by contrast, sites that are primarily non-military. I hope I didn't muddle that. You got the distinction, right? Much greater emphasis on discrimination and proportionality is given now than at the time of the horrors of World War II and so-called total war, a war in which nearly all the barriers to means collapsed. Part of it was the fact that the available means, if you're part of the, considering the air war against Germany and against Japan, is that the available weaponry, the bombs being used and so on, the systems of guidance were all approximate, that the bombs did massive damage on the ground, and about the only way that you could guarantee that they would come close to their target is by sort of getting over the area and kind of unleashing your ordnance. And if, as came to be the Allies' goal in World War II, you wanted to destroy the morale, the warfighting morale of the German people or the Japanese people, then the bombs were dropped in the most built-up areas of cities, which meant that you had massive civilian casualties. Now, however understandable that may be in the context of a long, brutal, prolonged total war, it certainly does not pass muster, it seems to me, on this issue of the means of discrimination. And what the just war tradition provides for is that you can have a just cause, certainly World War II was a just cause, but that the means deployed in fighting that just cause may be somewhat suspect. It's very difficult, I think, to go back and make harsh judgments of that situation in light of the enemy that was, especially in Europe, that was being fought, and the way in which that enemy, Nazi Germany, was obviously prepared to lower every barrier to ethical restraint and moral decency. Well, the United States now certainly takes pains to discriminate. And this is attested to by the fact that our opponents, including Saddam Hussein in Persian Gulf War I and in Operation Iraqi Freedom, often forcibly relocate their own civilians into harm's way in an attempt to forestall U.S. military action. Why would one bother to do that if the United States didn't take pains to discriminate between civilian and military targets? Or they put ordnance and even war fighters in non-military sites so that there were riflemen and there was ordnance put in mosques in Iraq. Again, if the United States had no compunction in this regard, why would the Saddams of the world bother? Now, on the issue of how all this plays out in the Middle East and the Islamic world more generally, a few points should be made. Perhaps the most important is that just war is not a crusade and must never become one, if by crusade one means a holy war. Indeed, the just war tradition not only cautions against holy wars, it emerged in part in opposition to any such idea or practice. If you go back to the medieval record, you will find at the time of the Crusades in the Middle Ages, there were churchmen writing against the Crusades on the grounds of the just war tradition. The just war cannot countenance a holy war. So when observers claim that just war is just another name for holy war, they simply do not know what they are talking about. And this, I suspect, is done for tendentious reasons in nearly all cases. Let me just read you, just to remind you how aware our leaders are of this issue of no holy war, 3 or 4 sentences from President Bush's speech of September 20th, 2001, to the joint session of Congress, when the president made it clear that the war against terrorism was not a holy war, not a total war, and not an attack on a particular religion. This is what he said. I want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It is practiced freely by millions of Americans, by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Islam. The terrorists are traitors to their own faith, trying in effect to hijack Islam itself. The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It is not our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them. I don't know how you can make it clearer than that, that within the framework of just war, a holy war against a whole people or against a whole religion is quite simply ruled out. Now, a real challenge at present is to facilitate a robust discussion between the traditions of thinking about war and peace in the Western and Islamic traditions respectively. That is not an easy discussion to have. I believe it is going forward. I'm going to be in Germany next week for a discussion of terrorism in Potsdam. In April on the island of Malta, meeting between a group of us from the United States and scholars and thinkers from the Muslim Arab world to discuss precisely these issues, and then in May to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh, to continue this discussion. So it is going forward, but it is not an easy discussion to have. It makes it all the more important that at least some of us commit ourselves to that effort. Now, let me go back and just remind us for a few moments about the war against terror specifically, about 9/11. I fear that our memories of that are fading very quickly, and about what is involved and why we have to remain vigilant and why it is such a peculiar war in many ways, because you measure success when something doesn't happen. It's not a war where you can point to a successful battle or a great victory, but when nothing happens, then things are going well. When there's not another terrorist attack, when an airplane is not seized, when there isn't a suicide bomber in a train station, and so on. That's success, and I fear that we lull ourselves into thinking that not much is going on because we haven't had such horrors visited upon us again. That, to me, in fact, is an indicator that we're doing rather well in trying to disrupt the networks of those who mean to destroy us if they can. Now, I trust you will recall that at the time, from the president on down to the average person on the street, that the language of justice immediately rose to the fore as a way to characterize our response to 9/11. And when people did this, whether they knew it or not, they were tapping into the just war tradition, the origins of which I've already talked about in St. Augustine's 5th century masterwork, The City of God, and the challenge to Christians of this issue, of a commitment to the use of force. And it's important to remember that within the just war tradition, although force may be justifiable, it is never a normative good. It may be tragically necessary, but that does not make it a normative good. You do not lift it up as the norm. You lift it up as a requirement of justice if force is resorted to. And again, as a reminder, the most potent justification is to protect the innocent from certain harm. Now, according to Augustine, it is better for the Christian as an individual to suffer harm rather than to commit it. But when you rise to the level of a nation, rise to the level of a community, then things, if you will, reverse themselves. It is a responsibility of those who are the leaders to be, if you will, the protectors. They cannot make the commitment to nonviolence on behalf of others. They cannot make that commitment. That is not their prerogative. They are obliged to attempt to protect a people for whom they have undertaken direct responsibility. Now, the response to something like 9/11 involves the notion of just punishment. And this is not in order to inflict grievous harm on the non-combatants of a country whose operatives have harmed your citizens, but in order to interdict wrongdoers and to prevent further harm and to punish those responsible for the harm that has already occurred in a world that political theorists describe as one of self-help. That is, nobody else is going to do this for you. And when you undertake these actions in this way, you reaffirm a world of moral accountability and responsibility and justice. So it follows that when a wound as grievous as 9/11 is sustained, is inflicted on a body politic, it would really be a flight from the ethical vocation of politics to fail to respond. Now, as I'm sure all of you know, the Christian tradition tells us that government is instituted by God. This does not mean that every government and every public official is godly. We know better than that. But rather that he or she is charged with a solemn responsibility for which there is a divine warrant. Now, it seems to me an exercise in bad faith to accept this warrant, but then to disdain its effective use, even as one enjoys the undeniable benefits of civic peace. Government is responsible for that civic peace, so-called tranquillitas ordinis, the ordinary tranquility of the civic order. I've mentioned already that this understanding does not accept the Machiavellian realpolitik notion, but it also believes that it may be ethically not just harmful, but ethically objectionable to permit people to be harmed when you could have done something to prevent it. And it also suggests that you are not to cry peace, peace when there is no peace and no possibility of such, given that those who mean to harm you have declared that your entire country is composed of infidels who are fit only for destruction. That is, they did not issue, as you know, the hijackers of 9/11 didn't issue a set of negotiating points. That's not what happened. Now, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I said to a friend that this terrible day had reminded us of what governments are for. That is, none of the goods that human beings cherish, including the free exercise of religion that we cherish rightly in this country, can flourish absent a measure of civic peace and security. And if evil is permitted to grow, then good may go into hiding. People become fearful, and more harm is done than the immediate violent event. Because as people grow fearful, they begin to retreat, they begin to hide behind closed doors, and the ordinary goods of civic peace become much more difficult to achieve. Well, what are those ordinary goods? They're simple but profound goods that involve mothers and fathers raising their children. It involves men and women going to work. It involves citizens of a great city making their way on streets and subways in relative safety. It involves ordinary people buying airplane tickets in order to visit friends or family elsewhere. It involves men and women traveling in order to transact business. It involves people, the faithful, attending their churches, synagogues, and mosques without fear. Now, this basic civic peace is a great good. It is not the peace of the kingdom promised by Scripture. Government can never promise that. That would be a sacrilege. That peace awaits the end time. And indeed, that vision of peace is connected with certain conditions that we know are not available to us in the earthly kingdom, one in which the Lord's house has been established everywhere, and all go up to the mountain of the Lord, for out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, the Lord from Jerusalem. That is not the circumstance in which we find ourselves. That offers intimations, beautiful intimations of the peace of the kingdom, but we are not there yet, to put it mildly. Or as Martin Luther once observed, on this earth, if the lion lies down with the lamb must be replaced frequently. Now, as I said, the ordinary civic peace that horrific violence disrupts does offer us the peace of the kingdom. And these are goods to be cherished. These are goods we should never make light of. These are goods we charge our public officials with maintaining. Again, if we live from day to day in fear of deadly attack, then these other goods become more difficult to attain, because human beings, as being the soft-shelled creatures that we are, we cannot reveal the fullness of our being, including our deep sociality, if airplanes are flying into buildings and if cities become piles of rubble. So we can neither take this civic peace for granted, something we learned so shockingly, nor can we shake off responsibility for helping to respect and to promote the norms and rules whose enforcement is constitutive of this civic peace. Now, public officials are charged then with this task, with the task of protecting a people. We all play our part in our dealings with one another, obviously, and in building the sort of sinew and tissue of community. What I found extraordinary, and I'm sure you did too, with 9/11, was the fact that the heroes of that day, many of whom lost their lives, didn't see what they were doing as heroic at all, that they were simply doing their jobs. And we were reminded of what those jobs are, and how frequently we take the fact that there are people doing that for granted. I would submit that the same holds for our military, that it's their job, and it's our sons and daughters who do it. And they do it under right authority. That's a vital dimension of the just war tradition. And it was aimed at limiting opportunistic, freelance, individualistic violence. So even as just war permits limited resort to arms, it also challenges the anything-goes approach to violence. Now, responding justly to injustice is a very tall order, because it may mean in some circumstances that it is preferable to risk the lives of your own combatants than to intentionally kill and target enemy non-combatants. It's often very difficult to separate combatants from non-combatants, but we are obliged to try. And I believe that the United States military, in fact, does do that. And that during the conflict and after the conflict, we as citizens are obliged to look at the conduct of our soldiers and to ask how it is they conducted themselves. Were they restrained? Were they under careful rules of engagement? Did it ever become a free-for-all? Was every attempt made to limit civilian casualties, knowing that in time of war civilians are invariably going to fall in harm's way? It is simply unworthy of the solemn nature of these matters to respond, as some have done, cynically or naively to attempts to limit the damage. As theologian Oliver Donovan put it at the time of Persian Gulf War in 1991, he said, just ask yourself whether you would rather have been a citizen of Berlin in 1944 or a citizen of Baghdad in 1991, as far as your chances of survival. And I think we all know where we would rather have been. The answer is obvious, because every effort was made in U.S. targeting strategy to avoid civilian targets during that war. Now, since the debacle of Vietnam and the restructuring of U.S. military, U.S. military men and women are taught codes of ethics that derive from the just war tradition, that pertain in the training of our soldiers and our sailors and our Marines and our flyers. No group in this country pays more attention to ethical restraint on the use of force than the U.S. military. I was 2 weeks ago in Montgomery, Alabama, at the Army, the U.S. Air Force Officer Training Command School. There are some 300, 400 officers or would-be officers in the Air Force being trained there. But it's also fascinating that the training, which includes this immersion in the just war tradition, extends at this point to 78 international officers from some 47 different countries, all the way from Albania to Venezuela, who are receiving this kind of training courtesy of the United States military. So we do not kill or threaten to kill 3,000 civilians because that number of our own civilians have been murdered. by perpetrators who do not deserve the name of either soldier or warrior. We put soldiers into combat rather than unleashing terrorists, and those who cannot mark the distinction between them have lost their ethical compass altogether. Now, let me start to wind down here so we have time for questions. We are living through an extraordinary moment in our nation's history. I have a hunch that things are as unsettled, perplexing, troubling, and even at times frightening as they were, let's say, in the early years of the Cold War. In the period right after the conclusion of World War II, everyone thought peace at last, and then, before you know it, within a couple of years, President Truman decides he has to do something to prevent a communist takeover in Greece. There was serious possibility that Italy might go to the communists. Korea is invaded. I have a hunch that as the Truman administration was searching for a framework within which to think about this new development, this new frightening and seemingly chaotic world, you had the Berlin airlift and so on, that we're in a similar circumstance now. We have to at least take it that seriously. We have to prepare for it. We have to think about it. We have to understand it will go on for a long time, as the Cold War did. And Americans were prepared to soldier that responsibility, and I believe that they are prepared to soldier it again. Now, in the dark days of Nazi terror, there was a brave young German theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was hanged by the Gestapo in the waning days of the war for his involvement in a conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Before the war, he had been moving toward pacifism. And then as he looked around and saw what was happening, especially to the Jewish people, he argued, this cannot stand. We have to put a spoke in the wheel. We have to cut off the head of the snake. And he wrote an essay asking who stands fast, who's prepared to deal with this. And he observed that the great evil that was Nazism that had appeared was, quote, playing havoc with our ethical concepts, that we have to think in fresh ways about what is going on. And he was particularly severe in his criticism of those who, in his words, fled from public altercation into the sanctuary of private virtuousness. But anyone who does this must shut his mouth and his eyes to the injustice around him. Only at the cost of self-deception can he keep himself pure from the contamination arising from responsible action. What does Bonhoeffer mean here? He means that when we act in the world, we can never foretell precisely and with absolute certainty what the consequences are going to be. That one has to try to minimize harm that might come, knowing that inadvertently there might be harm from an intervention that one has made in order to try to prevent even greater harm. That is the nature of the world we are in. Clausewitz wrote about the fog of war. There is simply a fog attendant upon politics more generally. Now, there are times, in other words, when the call to live, to continue to commit oneself to the goods that I have described as the goods of everyday life, requires action against those who would disrupt that way of living, who are claimed by death. Osama bin Laden saying, our young people, what's wrong with the United States is our young people cherish life, and ours cherish death and seek death. Well, against those claimed by death, one has to uphold the dignity and the beauty and the gift of life, knowing that in the fight against those claimed by death, some precious lives will be lost. That, too, that tragedy, if you will, that recognition of tragedy, is consistent with the just war tradition. It is consistent with the fact that within Christianity and the just war tradition as lodged within it, believers are claimed by a God of mercy who is also a God of justice. And these two must always, certainly for the believer, come together in any approach to these issues of war and peace, and our reaction as citizens to what's happening with us, to us, and the action of which we are the central participants in the world as we know it today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I understand that we have some time for questions. I know there are others clearly who have other obligations, but I think, Drew, you have a mic, right? So if you have a question, Drew will try to get to you with a microphone so that everyone. I'll tell you what. Let's take a minute, and those who have to leave, go ahead and leave, and then we'll go to questions. Let's do that, so that we won't have too much disruption. And I'll see some of you tomorrow, I believe. Okay. I'm okay on water, yeah. All right, please.
Thank you very much. You made a good point about in a just war concept that one is obligated not to attack innocent citizens, but rather to attack the military establishment. Could you comment on that in regard to the recent Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Oh, God. Yes, I will, but it's just, I mean, that is, that's become, as you know, such a horror and a deepening tragedy, because in that situation, as you know, where people are teeth by jowl, I mean, they're just on top of each other. Those of you who've been to Israel, been to Palestine, know that these are terribly densely populated areas. Certainly the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and Hamas do not wear uniforms. They do not identify themselves as people engaged in military activities. They blend in with the regular population. They hide after they've committed usually some atrocities, since targeting civilians seems to be the preferred method. The idea, I suppose, being that if enough damage is inflicted continually on Israeli civilians, sooner or later something will come out of it that will redound to the benefit of the Palestinians. I don't think that's clear thinking at all, but that certainly is the thinking that tends to dominate. So you have, if you're thinking within the framework of a just war tradition, you have a massive violation from the very beginning, because that tradition requires that people who are soldiers be identifiable as such. The only way to distinguish combatants from non-combatants is that one can tell the difference between them, and certainly that a legitimate combatant is to do everything he can to ensure that non-combatants not come in harm's way. So the process of sort of blending in and of hiding, in the midst of often one's own family, does mean that when the Israelis find out that you're there and decide they're going to take you out, and they know you as one of the perpetrators, leaders of Hamas or Al-Aqsa, and Israeli intelligence attempts to conduct these raids when they are likely to do the least possible harm to civilians. But as we know, this is often not possible. It's not just that stuff goes astray, it's precisely because people are blended in with one another. Do I think the Israelis have overplayed their hand? Yes, I do. I think often that's been the case. One does have to say, however, that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are always identifiable as such. That with the exception of some activities by the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, who have sometimes conducted raids and sometimes conducted assassination raids, actually, on leaders of Fatah, when many of them were in exile. The battle primarily is between the IDF, the daily battle, the IDF, and those who are planning the suicide bombings at this point. That's the primary form of activity. Now, if the Palestinians were primarily focusing on trying to, let's say, blow up a tank or trying to attack soldiers at certain sentry points and so on, then you would say, well, they're trying at least to bring some restraint, into their use of violence. But alas, one doesn't see, I fear at this time, any attempt to discriminate in the way the just war tradition requires. I know that the Israeli Defense Force is trained in the just war tradition. My good friend Michael Walzer, who's written arguably the most important book on the just war tradition in the last 30 years, and it's become something of a contemporary classic, goes to Hebrew University every year and gives lectures on this and meets with officers of the IDF to work on these themes and these ethical restraints. People get so inflamed in these face-to-face encounters that sometimes the restraints clearly are forgotten and simply fall by the wayside. I don't know what it's going to take in that circumstance. I suspect, to finally bring about some settlement, I suspect that the radically altered geopolitical situation in the Middle East, with the collapse of Saddam Hussein, with Libya now suddenly saying, we want to trade with you, we'd rather that you not come and do to us what happened in Iraq, we're going to give up our WMD. You have protests being mounted with some frequency in Iran now by students, women's groups and so on against the repressions of the theocracy there, that all of these kinds of changes will mean that will have a salutary effect in changing the mentality with which the Palestinian leadership under Arafat has worked. There's a very significant and impressive group of Palestinian leaders, people prepared to take leadership positions in politics, in scholarship, and so on. The Palestinians are the most educated among Middle Eastern Arab peoples, in fact. But until that kind of tired, corrupt leadership in Fatah is finally out of the way, and the money dries up to support these suicide bombings, because as you know, there's huge incentives involved. So money's for families. Saddam Hussein was giving, as you know, equivalent $15,000 to the family for every child who turned into a suicide bomber. Libya, of course, has been a central place for supporting terrorism. Once that starts to dry up, I suspect that we are going to get some alterations in the way in which, in the nature of the conflict from the Palestinian side. And then from the Israeli side, I think a lot's going to depend on whether Sharon has the political gumption to start to dismantle the settlement, since that's, as you know, a barrier to a two-state solution, and also whether Israel will come to a point where they feel confident enough that people are not going to be murdered as they sit in restaurants or travel buses, that they will begin to dismantle the wall that they've put up. So we will see signs of it when it starts to change, but I don't anticipate that we'll see them for a while. It takes a while for the new realities to set in, I think.
Professor Elshtain, you answered that excellently, because principles we may all agree upon, but it's the application of principles to messy, concrete circumstances that's where the pitfalls really are. Let me give you another pitfall. Since you are obviously a person of principle, maybe we can benefit by seeing the application. Let's go to North Korea. If there's any group of people on the planet who are living in the worst circumstances imaginable, it has to be North Korea. What policy would you urge on President Bush, given your equal regard doctrine?
There's just to underscore, Valerie, your point. There's a powerful memoir by a woman named Sun Uk Lee, Sun Uk Lee, called Eyes of the Tailless Animal. She converted to Christianity while she was in one of the huge gulags in North Korea. You can see these huge prison camps from satellite imagery. You can see exactly where they're located, and they're such vast complexes that they're easy to identify. She had been put into one of these gulags because she evidently hadn't done a favor that was requested of her by some local commissar. He had some quota to meet of people that he was personally responsible for putting into a camp, and she fell afoul of him. And she tells, the most horrific stories of what happens in there, including the strangling of newborn babies, women prisoners who give birth. They first try to kill the child in utero, but if that isn't successful, the women give birth often to a live baby. And she said, and she personally witnessed this, and the way they get rid of the babies is just to quickly strangle them. So this is the nature of that regime. I think I'll start in this way. First of all, the North Korean situation shows you how your flexibility in response becomes more and more limited once a country acquires a nuclear capability. The possible damage that could be done by North Korea against South Korea, for example, is so extensive that the just war norm criterion about probability of success, we have to measure good and harm, would certainly come into play in a big way. I think that means at this point that a military response is not open to us, given the massive harm that might result. And what is open to us, first of all, just to correctly identify what's going on there, which President Bush has done, in defining that regime and characterizing it as an evil regime. In other words, in naming it correctly. That's part of the burden of the argument in my book. And I think that, when Secretary of State Albright went there, when former President Carter went there, and they clink their glasses and drink a toast and say, these are people we can work with, that doesn't signal, first of all, it's unbearably naive, but secondly, it doesn't signal, our severe disapproval of what's going on there. So I think that needs to be registered clearly. And then whatever forms of pressure can be brought to bear have to be brought to bear. And I think we've already been doing some of that by engaging the Chinese and trying to, interestingly enough, and trying to curb any reckless action on the part of North Korea. The Chinese don't want to get involved in an open conflict. So there are ways you can get powers in the region who are worried about this rogue state going completely ballistic. There are ways you can put moral pressure on. I'm not sure what economic avenues are available to us because it's a society that really it's not involved in free trade, as you know. So many of the economic incentives that might be available just aren't available. And I'm just not sure what else one can do. I would obviously welcome advice from anyone else, but my hunch is that as more of the world moves towards, and I think we are moving that direction slowly, towards sort of limited constitutional regimes. If you look at the possibilities in the Middle East, if you look at some other changes that are going on, the hope that's sprung up in a number of places for decent regimes by comparison compared to indecent ones, that as the wider milieu and the wider system begins to change, I think that individual states cannot remain unaffected by that. So it's going to be a long-term proposition with North Korea, unless suddenly someone comes in who does a sort of Gaddafi turn, but I don't think we can anticipate that anytime soon. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks.
You were talking about the factors of the just war tradition,
Yeah.
and you talked about war being a last resort, war when you believe that others will use aggression against you, war with the right intention, and so on. You listed a few others. And then you said if all of these factors come together, then you have what's known as just cause for war.
Yes.
Then you further stated that war, even though you may have just cause for war, that may not necessarily be the best way to proceed. My question is, if the factors of the just war tradition have come together, if it really is a last resort, and if you really do believe that others will use aggression, how can it be that war isn't the only option?
Let's leave out, if you really believe others are going to use aggression against you, for a minute. Okay, let's leave out imminent threat for a minute, but put all the other criteria in there. Remember that one of them is this prudential calculation about the possible consequences. So that means that in any circumstance, you're going to have to evaluate the nature of the possible response should you embark on the use of force, and whether the possible response, the kind of force that can be brought to bear by those that you are thinking of deploying force against, would be so overwhelmingly awful, or potentially so, not perhaps just to yourself, but to others, other innocents, including perhaps the citizens within the particular polity. I mean, it's not unheard of for ruthless regimes to punish people internally when they're fighting someone externally, to blame some internal group and say, we're wiping all of you out because we know you're in cahoots with these other folks. So all of that has to be weighed, which is why I said it can't be automatic, because that prudential issue, what is to come, has to weigh very heavily on the minds of those making a case. Now let's put in imminent threat. There it seems to me you really are tilting in the direction of the use of force, because at that point it's not just possible threat or likely threat, it's imminent threat. That means that you have evidence that is as certain as evidence on this earth can be, that society A is going to undertake harmful action against society B unless it is prevented from doing that, unless it is stopped. So that if you look at, for example, an example that Michael Walzer gives in his book is Israel's use of force in the '67 war, when Egypt had massed all of its tanks and its military and was prepared for an invasion, and Israel made the determination that, being a very small country, and if you get the entire sort of surround of Arab countries fighting against you, your chances of survival are not guaranteed, that they would take preemptive action in light of this imminent threat. Now, with the United States, I think many people believe that there can never be any such thing as imminent threat. That is against us, because we are so powerful, because we have eyes and ears almost everywhere, because we can deploy our forces so quickly by comparison to anybody else. We can project our power, that we can always wait and wait and wait. But I think what we saw with 9/11 tells us that, certainly in the case of terrorist networks who don't abide by any of the rules, are not states that are members of the United Nations, do not have diplomats out negotiating this or that, that you have to assume imminent threat at every moment, and prepare your response against it in order to guarantee that it not happen. Now that's, of course, rather different from imminent threat that might be faced from a particular state, and there the big worry, certainly on the part of policymakers at this point, is the coming together of sort of rogue regime that possesses WMD and international terrorist networks, so that you can have the terrorist groups gaining access to WMD because of the existence of these regimes. So that's another way to think about the possibility of imminent threat. If you know that that's happening, have very good evidence that's happening, and that a particular regime is in cahoots, if you will, in that way. In the case of the Taliban, it seems to me that that was a no-brainer. I mean, they were, on the issue of imminent threat, I mean, they were the site from which al-Qaeda was deploying its forces, if you will. And it was a regime that was already regarded as an outlaw regime, not recognized by any other country except Pakistan. So I think there, the issue of whether or not the use of force against the Taliban was justifiable did not even involve the issue of imminent threat because you were dealing with harm that had already occurred. Yeah.
Professor Elshtain.
Yes.
I was in the war with the Japanese,
Yes.
but in hindsight, I felt that the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not justified. Do you have a view on that matter?
Yeah, yes, I do. I argue in my book on women and war, in the section on the just war tradition and the use of the atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that it seems to me there's no way that that can be justified under the jus in bello rules. It was obviously an intentional targeting of civilians. There are others who disagree with me within the just war tradition. I mean, what's interesting is that within the just war tradition, you have lots of debates between and among people within the tradition on whether a particular use of a particular form of force in a particular situation was or was not justifiable. But even as I say that, because it's very easy to judge from hindsight, as you know, I recognize that the calculations that were available to the American president and military showed that in their eyes, their best reckoning, that not only would you have massive loss of American life, but of Japanese life if there was an invasion of the mainland, because the emperor had insisted that the Japanese were to fight to the last man, woman, and child if their homeland was invaded. And at that point, given the history of the terrible battles on Okinawa and Iwo Jima and so on, there was every reason to believe that that would happen, that you would have that kind of stubborn resistance and would have, well, almost incalculable loss of civilian life. Because remember, that invasion would have been clearly accompanied by a good bit of bombing, which had already done a tremendous amount of damage. You had a firebombing of Tokyo. Now, firebombing isn't intentional, as I'm sure. I mean, you don't say, I'm going to go firebomb. It happens to be a confluence of the use of ordnance with particular atmospheric conditions to set up the winds in such a way that you get this conflagration. But that had already been used and would have been used in an invasion of the mainland. So from hindsight, we don't know if more lives were lost or spared by the use of the atomic bombs. But I think that there's something about the symbolism of that that is very, very troubling, about the idea of 80,000 people in Hiroshima simply turning into shadows, you know, going up in smoke, or, and this is, I think, the particular horror evoked by the atomic bombs, is that the harm continues given the radiation effect and can even be passed on. So I would say that that it does not meet the standard of just war. Even as keeping it in context, we're going to understand why people wanted the war over. They were sick of it. This might actually save lives, certainly would save American lives. Let's do it. You can understand that, but that doesn't make it right.
Yes, Professor, I'm wondering if you might comment on the issuance of the Nobel Peace Prize and the possibility that maybe ironically it sort of promotes this unjust peace that you had talked about.
Well, that's an interesting question. I've never had that one before. You mean when it goes to, well, Arafat got it one year. Arafat and who was the Israeli? Rabin, right? Yeah. So, and I thought, what? You know, Rabin certainly made an effort, but even Rabin had been, as you know, had been a promoter of what he called the B-team policy against Palestinians, had been quite capable of using forms of force that make one rather squeamish. They gave it to, obviously they gave it to Jimmy Carter, who has acquired a kind of saintly status in many people's eyes. But I think one of the, and I do think, his work with Habitat Humanity and so on, Habitat for Humanity is very admirable. But I think there's been an unfortunate sort of naivete about Carter's dealings with, like the leaders of North Korea and other places where he seems to think that if we just sit down and talk to despots and so on, that somehow they'll come around. And then he condemns the use of force as if there's some other way to deal with terrible regimes like Saddam Hussein. One of the arguments certainly a moral philosopher would make is that if you will the end being the end of this regime, then you've got to will the means. And if that's the end you seek, then what means will get you there? And certainly, in the case of Saddam, diplomacy wasn't going to do it. It was quite clear that the sanctions weren't going to do it, that all they were doing was immiserating the Iraqi people and malnourishing them because he was using all the money from the oil for food, because unlimited amounts were available for, as you know, for food and medicine, pocketing all of that to his own purposes. So what other means were available? Or does one just continue to hope for the best? I mean, I think that's really an issue. Now, who got it this last? Oh, that's right, the Iranian woman. Yeah, that's right. I can't remember her name. That's probably okay. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting, though, that of all the public figures in the world today, the one who most clearly deserves it is Pope John Paul II, and they're never going to give it to him because he has the wrong views on abortion and some other things. And so, it's awful to become disillusioned, I suppose, about certain things. When I was a child, I held the Nobel Peace Prize in such high regard, and now it's really tarnished in my mind because you know that these decisions are very political ones, and that people who really deserve it, including the current Pope, are not going to get it.